you can check your coat at the door, but you can't check your homophobia. There was a lot of internalized homophobia
Mm,
in the club. There was a
mm.
lot of people who didn't particularly like themselves or other people because they had internalized homophobia. And so there was a lot of self loathing.
So I seem to be getting increasingly sappy with you recently, and I'm not really sure why that is. Whether it's like just because I'm getting softer in my older years, or if there's like an accumulation of gratitude that's just bubbling to the surface every now and then. But either way, I just want to give you the heads up that I'm about to get sappy on you once more. And my sappiness is because I love the network of stories that this podcast is building and how one conversation leads to another conversation, which then leads to another conversation. And I love that I'm able to have these conversations and form this real sense about cities that I've never been to or decades that I wasn't alive for, all thanks to the stories that my guests share and how they navigated and responded to what was going on for them at that time in their life. Which brings me to the city of Edmonton in Canada. So a few weeks ago, I spoke with the singer-songwriter Dorje about The Roost, and during that conversation, they told me about another legendary space that existed in the city, which was called Flashback. And Flashback was dubbed the Studio 54 of the Prairies, and was so legendary that it's recently become the subject of a documentary. So obviously, I had to go and find out more about this. And in my search, I found Matthew Hayes, who, along with his brother, was responsible for making the documentary and bringing it into the world. And so I reached out and I got in touch and I asked if he would be on the show, and luckily he said yes. And in our chat, we talked about sneaking into Flashback when Matthew was still underage and too young to be there, what it was like to revisit the past while making the film. And of course, we got to talk about his favorite hobby at the time that he was going there, husband hunting. Shall we find out some more?
With my friend Terry, we would go and seek out. We were husband hunting when we
Husband
went.
hunting.
We were out there.
Ooh,
Yeah.
talk to me about the most effective way to snare a husband in a club.
Well, I never did it there, so I don't know. I was doing everything
Oh,
wrong.
okay,
I mean,
yeah,
I was
maybe I
trying.
worded that question wrong. Okay, tell me how you approached it in that club.
Well, I tried to dress nicely and I tried to look good, and I was a cute young blonde gay guy, and I was just trying to meet somebody, and I found it a frustrating culture to you. It's more of a hookup culture, and I
Mm-hmm.
just think that you know, I, I talked to a lot of gay men about this experience, especially at that time, but you're kind of frustrated with other gay men because you feel like they're so flighty. I felt like everyone's so flighty and no one has an attention span. And really, I was pretty flighty myself. So I was pretty picky. I was like, I would hook up with a guy and then go, well, he's not quite right for me. So I just didn't have any staying power
Ah,
or
okay.
attention span in a relationship. And I think a lot of gay men were like that. And so we were all a bit frustrated. We're all like, I really want to be in a relationship. It doesn't seem to be working out. And part of that was just within ourselves too. It was hard to let yourself.
Mm-mm.
I mean, you have to remember the culture was just. I used to say this about Flashback. You can check your coat at the door, but you can't check your homophobia. There was a lot of internalized homophobia
Mm.
in the club. There was a
Mm.
lot of people who didn't particularly like themselves or other people because they had internalized homophobia. And so there was a lot of self loathing. And so, yeah. And
But so interesting that like it manifested for you in that way. Because when you said I was always looking for my husband, or I was looking for Mr. Right, my assumption was that you would attach yourself to people immediately and try and like hang on to them, rather than being like, no, he's no good for me. He's no good, and moving on.
Well, I mean, it was, you know, the downside of being single. It was just, it always felt like either somebody was kind of interested in me who I wasn't quite sure about, or
Mm,
I was really into somebody who just wasn't into me. So
mm.
it's like, take your pick. And for somebody who's as sensitive as I am, rejecting somebody was often just as painful as getting rejected. So it's like,
Do you want to practice rejecting on me right now?
no, I just remember, it's sad because people were often really messed up. I mean,
Yeah.
people were dealing with rejection from their families. It was still a culture steeped in homophobia, so people often, it's people want to romanticize that time, right? They
Mm-hmm.
look back and say, "Act up! Oh wow, people were energized and there was solidarity." It was a really difficult time, and there was a lot of isolation and alienation within the club culture. Like, I remember how cliquey it was at Flashback. People were in their own little tribes, their own little cliques. I remember introducing two people, and one of them said to me, "I can't be friends with someone with that hairstyle. I just can't." Like, it
Mm.
was it was very much like that. So, and there was a lot of attitude. I mean, I know people will joke about throwing shade, but after a while, that just became really part of the alienation for me. So,
But are you saying that attitude, or at least some of that attitude, was coming from internalized homophobia?
possibly, yeah, I think in many cases it is. I will say that Lucas Hildebrandt, who's a wonderful author, wrote this great book called "The Bars Are Ours" that just came out this last year, and I reviewed it. Such a great writer, and he says he does extensive research on American bar culture and talks about different bars in different places
Mm-hmm.
and cities and what they brought to the table, what they brought to the culture. And one of the things he says in his introduction, which really hit me, was he said the bars were not utopias, but they were ours. So they were something that we had. There were good things that came out, but we're not utopias. There were lots of things that went on in the clubs. There were racist attitudes, there was misogyny, there was cliquishness and exclusion, and that was what really hit me, because after a while at Flashback, after many years of going sometimes 2 or 3 nights a week, I was really trying to find Mr. Right. After a while, I grew so weary of a lot of the attitudes and a lot of what went on there, and I found it kind of repetitive. And I just stopped going for, like, I think about a year or two.
Mm-hmm.
I just said, I'm just going to go. If I meet with friends, there was a great restaurant in Edmonton called Cafe Select. I'll just go there and hang out because I feel more comfortable there than I do. I'll mix with my straight and gay friends. But I found that
Mm.
Flashback wasn't the all accepting place that I hoped that it would be.
But there's two things going on there in my interpretation of what you've just said. So correct me if you disagree. There was the fatigue of looking for Mr. Right and always being on and always on the lookout, coupled with the alienating attitudes and the cliquishness and the bitchiness and meanness of the people in there.
Yeah, I mean, I just I thought that my experience in high school had been so good with my friends
Mm-hmm.
in that drama club who had been so caring and loving and accepting. And I don't know why, I foolishly thought, well, the gay community will be similar to this. And
Mm.
when I turned around and spent more time around a lot of gay men, I found a lot of gay men were actually really quite judgmental. A lot of gay men were kind of rude and were just not. There was this whole thing, and I don't know if it's still a thing in clubs, but everyone was just hurling attitude at everybody else. It was like,
Mm.
you're not good enough to be in my circle of friends. And there were all these little cliques, and I just went, well, I'm not enjoying this that much. I mean, I still went sometimes, but I just sort of said, I'm just going to hang out with people who make me happy,
Mm.
and I'm not going to force myself to spend time in gay spaces if it's not working for me.
Mm.
That was my conclusion ultimately.
One thing that I keep thinking about recently, and so I'm just going to get on my soapbox and have a bit of a rant now, so apologies, but at least you get a little break from talking, is this thing that in clubs and in these types of spaces where there's the potential for flirting or there's the potential for hooking up or whatever, but it's not necessarily like the key driver of the place, I find people are so dreadful at just talking to other human beings.
Yeah.
It's like they want to reject you so they don't get your hopes up, but you're not even necessarily searching to
Yeah.
flirt or to do anything with them. You're just like, oh, hey, you're standing here, let's have a chat. And then they're just like, they don't know how to treat you like a human, so they're just horrible to you. And then you're like, well, hang on, what? Like, what? And then if you have a number of those interactions in the night, then you're just like, well, I should have just stayed at home. But all it would have taken for you to have a good night was for people to be like, oh, yeah, it's really busy here, isn't it? Ah, ha, ha, ha. Or like some kind of bullshit small talky thing, and then
Yeah.
treat you and like see you as a person, see you as a human, and then move on with their evening. And yeah, anyway, that's my rant. I find that fascinating.
Well, I completely agree with that rant. And the other thing I would say that drove me absolutely bonkers about, and that was just Edmonton, that was also Montreal and Toronto and everywhere I would go to gay clubs, is you would go out to a club and the music was so loud, um, and it was like,
Yeah.
and it was just often a beat. It wasn't really a nice song. It was just a beat. So I used to say, this is just like visiting my last migraine. And I guess I was a cranky old man by the time I was 25 because
Oh,
I was like,
lean
why
in.
don't, for me, I was like, okay, why don't you design a club like this? Why don't you have this space where people can dance and be on poppers and
Hmm,
not
hmm.
want to have a conversation? And then have another part of the bar where you're playing some Motown music, but at a volume where people can have a conversation. I wanted to talk to people. I wanted to get to know people, just like you were talking about. But in gay clubs, often there was nowhere you could go to just have a chat. And
Mm.
so I found making a connection with somebody else that much harder because it was all about this really incredibly loud music. So that was something else I found. I just wanted to go to a cafe and have a nice meal and chat with
Mm.
people and get to know people better.
Well,
That was the way I was feeling.
honestly, I think this is the reason that half the people of the world take up smoking is so that they've got somewhere to go that's quiet outside the
Oh,
bar, like, and then have a chat with
isn't that
someone.
so funny? That's funny because, of course, when in the '80s you could still smoke
Inside.
in
Oh,
bars.
oh.
Yeah, you're young. You're young.
That's
No,
so
people would smoke
horrible.
in there, and then when I moved to Montreal. I worked at a bar called La California,
Hmm.
which is kind of hilarious. And boy, the smoke was thick in there. Oh boy, it was. I would sometimes start tearing up, and people would say, "Are you okay?" Because they
Oh
thought I was
gosh.
crying because I was bussing tables, and it was like so smoky in there. It was crazy.
Mm. At least you saved money on smoke machines, though. You didn't have to buy one.
Well, it was like cheap. I was smoking like a pack a day when I was working in there, and I didn't have to buy a single cigarette.
Oh, I don't know if that's a good thing or not.
No, it's not.
Everyone's handing you cancer.
Yes, that's it. That's why they shut it down. Yeah.
um, oh, so what else can we complain about gay bars? What else is wrong with them?
Well, I feel bad because it was a refuge for a lot of people, and it was for me too. So I loved parts of it. I loved dancing. I did make friends there. I did hang out with my friends. Um, it's not. I don't want to pin this all on nightclub culture. I think it was like probably my own frustration just with queer culture itself.
Hmm.
I was feeling like, gee, I thought this would be a more welcoming place, and I wasn't finding it that welcoming. At that time, I was also, when I was in Edmonton working, I was very active with the gay club on campus.
Hmm.
So we organized a lot of events, fundraisers, and we also like had people to come in and talk about AIDS, HIV, and how, what safe sex and safer sex were. And so I was very active in those politics and that kind of thing, and got involved with the student paper, which was really fun. That's when I first started writing, and I interviewed. One of the first pieces I did was to interview Divine, John Waters'
Aww.
muse. Yeah, so that was very cool. So there were a lot of good times that I look back on. I think part of it was just adolescence,
Mm.
the
Yeah.
frustrations of adolescence that are always delayed for us as queer people, right? Because we can't live out those things in high school. They have to come a bit later. So we have this delayed adolescence, which is rocky for anyone at any time.
Mm-mm. Yeah. And I was going to touch on that before because there is that added element when you're in that nightclub of everyone just learning for the very first time how to be in those spaces, how to be a sexual being around others that they've not had that opportunity to practice before. There's another element here as well that I want to get your view on, and that is a queer space in a small town.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that Flashback existed was pretty astonishing.
Yeah. But also, in a small town, you see the same faces all the time. And it
Yeah.
gets very, well, depending on your outlook, it's very comforting or it's very depressing.
Yeah, there were many of the same faces. I wrote in 1991, I think it was. I wrote for a business magazine called the Edmontonians,
Ooh.
and so I used to say that's not to be confused with the New Yorker. So I was writing for the Edmontonians, and I remember interviewing some guys, the business people, doing little profiles of business people, whatever they were hawking, and I could see that they were gay, and I would see them at the Flashback or the Roost, and they
Mm.
would be quite rude to me. They didn't want to talk to me.
Oh,
Yeah, so they were kind of in their business identities as business people. They would talk to me because they wanted the article, but they didn't want to know me. They didn't want me identifying them as gay because it might hurt their business careers or whatever it was. They were just conservative. There were these layers of the closet there that
yeah.
were really kind of complicated and weird, and I just kind of sometimes thought, well, who are you? Who do you think you're fooling, pal? But
Yeah, but that kind of thing is so gross though, because it's hard. It's not personal at all, but sometimes it's hard to not take that personally.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That was really strange. Yeah, that was a trip, but that was part. I don't want to just assign that to Alberta. That was also the time. I mean, it was
Yeah.
a very different time. Yeah, that was part of the scene. There were people who came in who were closeted, who very much didn't want to be approached if you saw them on the street. They did not want that at all, right?
Yeah, oh, and like that, I can kind of get behind. Like, I can kind of understand that. But when you're in that safe, I'm using inverted commas, but when you're in that safe space together, when they're just like, get away from me, don't talk to me, don't acknowledge that you know me. I don't know. I just think that's just grim. It's just rude. It's horrible.
I I agree, obviously. Yeah.
Well, anyway, let's not focus on them. So I wanted to follow up about this search for Mr. Right. So initially, when you'd started going to the club regularly, that was the mission, like find someone, lock it down, get married, happy ever after, off we go.
Mission Impossible.
And then you got a bit jaded with the club and you started to stop going, like, or not go as frequently.
Yeah.
What happened to the hunt for Mr. Right?
I just simply told myself that I had convinced myself that there was something wrong with being single,
Oh,
and that there was nothing wrong with that, that that's like a different way of being. There are different kinds of relationships, and you should take joy in your friendships with your family members. My mom and I were really close, and my dad and I were close too. And I had a kid brother. My father remarried and had a kid brother, so I like to spend time with him, spend time with my siblings, spend time with my friends, my close friends, and take pleasure and joy in that. And then if something happens, great, but you're walking around with all these expectations, and that's probably getting in the way of things because you've just got all these expectations rolling around in your head. So it really did me a world of good to take a deep breath and make that realization that I would be happier when I wasn't searching frantically. I was happier. I mean, I just had a better time when I was doing that. And then what happened was I moved to. First of all, I studied in New York for a semester at the School of Visual Arts, and then I moved to Montreal. So then everything kind of shifted. My world really shifted after that.
because there were more men?
Yeah, definitely Montreal is a whole different experience because when I got to Montreal, the thing about Quebec society, Montreal is in Quebec.
Mhm.
Quebec was dominated by the Roman Catholic Church for many, many decades. And then in the 1960s, the early 60s, something called the Quiet Revolution happened. And that is when Quebec threw off the shackles of the Catholic Church, who had told the population that they didn't have to learn to read and write, who had told the population that the main thing a woman should be doing is popping as many babies as they possibly can, breed for God. And they said they rejected the church, and they said education must be paramount. And suddenly, within 20 years, within one generation, the province went from being a backward society to one of the most progressive societies in the world. We had massive investments in education, in public transit. The literary godfather of Quebec is Michel Tremblay, who was a queer man. So Montreal is just so different, so laissez-faire. No one cares if people are gay here. I find it very, very open. And there were lots of gay clubs, and I worked in a gay bar here for a while. And Montreal really is where I learned to be a hoe. That's
Was it something you learned, or was it just an innate thing that was opened by Montreal?
a little bit of both, but I just got much more comfortable with going out, letting it all hang out, and having
How
lots of
interesting.
fun with lots of different guys, and it was great. I mean, the Montreal culture was just so open that I will always cherish that about Montreal. I mean, I was pretty trashy, but I loved it. I was great. I had a great
There
time.
is
I had a
nothing
lot of
wrong with
fun. I
being
mean,
trashy. So you attribute it all to Montreal and not to you getting older and more comfortable in your skin.
a bit of both,
Okay.
but Montreal definitely sure helped. And I had never really, for example, I had never really in Edmonton wandered about and cruised, like the
Mm-hmm.
idea of cruising, which now is lost because of Grinder and Scruff. But in Edmonton, if you looked at someone a little too long, somebody might threaten your life.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a no looking at dudes kind of place. But in Montreal, you could look at other men, and a straight man wouldn't care. He would just say, "Oh well, there's a gay man ogling me." That's kind of a compliment. But if the person was gay, they would look back, and you knew, and you look back at each other, and then
You'd find a bush.
within 15 minutes you could be in the sack together, right? So it was great.
No, but then you have to be ready all the time. That sounds awful.
I have to say that was night and day with Edmonton. I mean, it really was such a culture shock to get to Montreal and find that far less judgment and far more open to any and all sorts of people and different identities, and
Mm.
and more fun.
And what's fascinating here as well is that shift in you, because obviously I'm just going by the story that you've told me and I'm filling in all the blanks on my own. But you went from someone who was like, I need to be in a long term relationship, I need to be like settling down, I need to have someone else to prove my worth, to then just being like, hey, fancy coming round to bunk? And that's a huge shift.
Well, I have to one major caveat, and that was I still was actually. I mean, I enjoyed the
Carnal desires. Hmm.
yeah, I was enjoying that, and it was lots of fun. But I still actually was looking for a companion. I still wanted to find somebody who I could. I really wanted that, so I was still at times, kind of sad, that it seemed elusive for me to meet somebody who I could settle down with. So there
Mm.
was still that going on, but I was having more fun.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, have fun at the same time, right? Like, don't just sit home feeling sorry for yourself. Go out and
Yeah,
see what's out there in the long grass. We've gone off from flashback, so let's go back to Edmonton. Sorry,
yeah.
to leave
No, no,
Montreal.
that's me. That's me doing
No, no,
that.
no,
Yeah.
no. I want to hear of the shenanigans with these men. But let's go back to flashback. Do you remember when it closed? Like, were you still living in the city then?
I remember that it moved location, and the old location got turned into condos. And then I remember going to the new location, and I didn't think it was a great space. It just didn't. It was the same people running it, but it just didn't seem to quite work in the same way as the old space did.
Mm.
And then I remember hearing that it closed down, and I was sad. Flashback had been a really important institution and very well known. Like people knew about it when they'd come to town. Like if people came to town, they'd say, "Well, I've heard about this place called Flashback, so you have to take me there."
Mm.
Right? So it was kind of well known in Canada. It was actually renowned. So that was kind of interesting. But I was sad. I was very sad when I heard that it closed. I was like, "Oh, that's at the end of an era."
And to what do you think Edmonton lost?
I guess I don't. I'm sorry that it's gone. I'm sorry that Flashback had to close, but I just sort of see it as what Edmonton gained from having a space like that. I
Oh.
think that, yeah, it did a lot of wonderful things for the city. I think a lot of straight people got to know gay people because they went there and had a great time. When we went back 2 summers ago, when we went back, I flew back to Edmonton when my brother was directing the recreations where we recreated Flashback at a place called Evolution Wonder Lounge,
Mm.
which is a gay club there now, queer club, and we recreated Flashback as best we could. And we had young people dancing and pretending to be flashback in the 80s. And it struck me that this time, this place, we're doing our best to recreate it, but it was this very specific period from the 70s into 1991. It was mainly about the 80s.
Mm.
It was a bridge. It saw us through this time, and I think that spirit goes on. And when we were back doing that, I got a lot of emails from people. Some people, because we did some press, right?
Yeah.
Articles in the local press about it, and I got a lot of emails from people, and some people said, "I remember you, and remember the times we had at the club." But then there were people who I don't remember, I'd never met, but they said, "I'm just so glad you're making this film because this was such a huge influence on me as a young person." In particular, one woman wrote to me and said, "I'm a straight woman, and I felt like I came out at Flashback." She
Mm.
said, "I could go there. Most clubs and bars you went to in Edmonton," she said, "as a straight woman, you just got hit on by really creepy guys. It was gross.
Mm.
You could go to Flashback and really have a good time and let your hair down and dress however you wanted and wear your makeup however you wanted and wear your hair however you wanted and have a great time and not feel that you have to fend off anyone. You
Mm.
just could have fun and hang out, dance with drag queens or gay men or do whatever you wanted." And a lot of people really had these really powerful memories about being there. And so I'm glad my brother made the film because I think it's an important historical point in the history of the prairies of Canada.
Yeah. And what a wonderful gift for you to give to people.
Yeah, I think that the screenings that we've had back in Alberta have been very, very rewarding. A lot of people have been, in tears at the end of the screening, and so this brought back so much for me. And young people have been seeing it, saying, "I can relate to this film
Mm.
because it's not that far from what we're going through now. Like it's similar to finding a safe queer space now
Hmm.
where we can dance and be ourselves."
Mm. Has there been any strange things that have bubbled up for you in creating the documentary?
That's a good question. I think that when I left and came to Montreal, it was not unusual for me to speak very disparagingly, frankly, of
Hmm.
Alberta to Edmonton, and you know, and I think that I've learned over the years because I go back. I still have my brother lives in Calgary, Pete, who made the film, but also my other brother lives in Edmonton still, and I have close friends there. And so I go back and see people, some people who are in the film. I go back and have lunch with or whatever, and I think that I had that attitude, which was a very natural reaction to feeling that the place that I grew up in really hated me, because
Mm.
that's how I did feel about Alberta. But when I go back, I see that this was, as Margaret Lawrence once said, the Canadian writer, this is where the world began for me, for better or worse. And I see a lot of the beauty in it. I take a walk in the River Valley and see how beautiful that is. I think about Katie Lang, who I've interviewed, who I love, and she came from Alberta. And I think about a lot of the really great things that happened to me there. My friends in high school who I met, who I mentioned in the drama club, who were so dear to me and still so dear to me. I see a lot of the really great things. I think Flashback, for me, felt like a bit of a love letter to
Mm.
the city, to the resistance that was there, to the spaces that people tried their hardest to create to make a positive place. Didn't always work perfectly, but they tried really hard to make it a good space for people to be in. And so I think that was, I think that was really revelatory for me. I feel like, people often do have this sort of resentment for the place that they grew up. Like,
Oh,
I have to
yeah.
get the hell out of here,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like, people often
absolutely.
do have that
Mm.
feeling, and so it's a complicated negotiation when you go back and say, part of that was just the time of your life that you were in, your adolescence. It was complicated. There were a lot of complicated feelings. There was dealing with being gay and coming out and being comfortable with yourself. And when I go back, I see a lot of the really beautiful things and the good people there and the good things there and the beauty of the place. And so that was a
Mm.
big part of the shift that happened when we were making the film. And so that's a good question because that was
Mm.
the feeling I had.
If you think about that 17-year-old version of you that was showing up at Flashback and somehow miraculously got let in, even though he did not look of age and should not have been there, what do you admire most about him?
I actually think that in spite of enduring a fair bit of bullying because I was so obviously gay, I look back and think, you know what? I had courage. I did. I mean, I didn't look like a tough kid, but I actually was. I if I saw things that interested me, like acting, I went and did it, and I really enjoyed those years doing that. I didn't become a professional actor, but and then I walked into the student paper and said, I want to write for the student paper, and I did it, and that was my beginnings in journalism.
Mm.
And any of those things, some people would say, I kind of want to go do that, but they wouldn't. And I was always just going out and doing things, and people would say, what are your chances, of getting like an interview with Divine? Like, what are your chances of getting that, right? But I went to the club where he was performing. He was performing 2 nights in a row, and he was at a club that was attached to a hotel. So I just went, well, he's obviously going to be staying in the hotel. So I went, and I knew that his manager's name was a guy called Bernard J. And so I said, is Bernard J staying here? And they said, well, yeah. So I left a note for him. And sure enough, the next day I got a call saying, yeah, he'll do an interview with you, even though you're a student journalist. And so I rushed down to interview him. So like I did things like that were just kind of fun.
Mm.
And so I look back and go, well, you took initiative, and that was really cool. I wish just I could tell myself to relax a little bit more at that age. I think I was probably pretty had sort of anxieties about things, but not that much has changed. I still have anxieties, but I still,
Oh.
I think, just a little less neurotic. I was a neurotic kid.
Or like neurotic in different ways, because, there's more than one way
Yeah,
to
I was pretty
indulge your
neurotic.
neuroses.
Yeah, yeah.
And that is us for yet another week. Thank you once again for joining me. If you love this chat and if you want to find out more about the Flashback documentary, then make sure that you go to their website, flashbackdocumentary.ca, or follow them on Instagram at flashbackdocumentary, and there'll be all the information there about how you can get your eyes on this film. Right, I hope you have a good day. If you want to reach out to me, make sure you find me on TikTok or Instagram at Lost Spaces Pod. And be here next Wednesday, same time, same place, and we'll have another chat for you to listen in on. Bye now.